I'll just start again and say hello again.
Hello, Daniel. Long time no see.
Yeah, we had about 2 or 3 encounters in 2002 while you were the external examiner of the Masters in Holistic Science at Schumacher College, and
That's right.
And it's fascinating because when you then gave me a couple of papers about inclusionality, as you called it then, I had this really strong intuitive sense that there was a really important theory that I needed to spend a lot of time on. And then my college course continued, and somehow and every now and then I got back to that folder and said, I must spend time with this. And now in the last few years, we've had a few contacts where we've exchanged papers. And this conversation has been 3 years in the waiting and making. So I'm finally really glad we're finally talking. And what I'm wanting to reflect on is how sometimes I certainly have the tendency when I sense that this is really important, that I really want to give it time, and therefore I delay it. And I'm wondering how often that has happened with your work, because you wrote this really big Springer published scientific book on your theory and your work, and I'm assuming it hasn't reached many classrooms yet. But let's start from the beginning of the story. Like, you're originally a mycologist, aren't you?
Yeah, originally I was a mycologist, and I no doubt learned an enormous amount from studying fungi, and in particular the fungi of the forest and how they work and the relationships they form with one another and with trees. And I used to give talks like how fungi aren't rotters, they're friends of the earth, and ideas like that.
And you did this. What's important is to say that you did this 25 years ago or longer, when it wasn't like recently people have woken up to the whole mycelial connection and the forest really being one big mycelial network underground and the trees talking to each other and all that. But you must have done some of the foundational research on that.
Well, I think I did. It's certainly something I talked about. And when I sort of gave my presidential address to the British Mycological Society in 1998, it was actually entitled Fountains of the Forest. And it included a painting which illustrated explicitly the relationship between the underground pipelines of the fungi and the trees, both in terms of the mycorrhizal partnerships, but also the role of the wood and litter decomposing fungi, and indeed of those fungi which will kill trees like honey fungus. So it was looking at the full picture of the relationships between fungi and trees, and understanding at that time, especially, I was in love with the idea of all life forms as embodied water flows. And therefore, and especially with fungi, sort of thinking of the way their fruit bodies erupt from the ground. They always emerge from tree trunks. They always remind me of fountains. So I wrote this piece for my presidential address. It had no references in. It just had a painting called Fountains of the Forest, which I gave to the society. And that was really more or less my swan song to mycology, because shortly afterwards, the difficulties I was having in the mycological world, and sort of the sense of distance I felt between the way most people understood and worked with fungi and the way I do or did, it was huge, and it affected my confidence. So I needed to break free, and it was a very difficult time actually, but I did break free, and that's when really my awareness of natural inclusion came through very, very strongly, actually, as a kind of breakthrough out of breakdown. And that also is when you encountered me, because at the time Brian Goodwin, was one of the very, very few scientists in the world
Understood what you were talking about.
Who understood what I was talking about
Yeah.
and why I was talking about it. And he saw my book, which was on the road to natural inclusion, which is called Degrees of Freedom.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wasn't there at the time I wrote that, but I was almost there.
It was called Degrees of Freedom, Living in Dynamic Boundaries.
That's the one, yes.
1997, Imperial College Press. So
So that was the book that I wrote on the threshold of my awareness of natural inclusion, but I had to break down before I got across the threshold. And it's a hell of a threshold, I think, to cross for most people, because it inverts the way most of us have been taught to think.
Well, the recent paper that you gave me did something like that to me in a sort of, like a spontaneous flip of awareness. And ever since, like, let me play this back, and it might be an oversimplification, but it's something that any meditator could really have a deep journey with if you simply keep your eyes open and you look at everything you see. And instead of looking at the matter, the materialized form that is out there, you then invert your awareness into what is the form between the things. And then you can zoom in even with, like, if you have scientific background, you know that even in an atom, most of it is in a molecule, most of it is space. And so, when you actually, like, I was just out on my paddleboard, and I was my way of preparing was trying to see the world in this flipped way, and it immediately, like, takes you into a very different space. And to build a new scientific theory and understanding of our relationship with each other and the natural world on that would really, like, what came to me was like, maybe Alan is working on the scientific foundations of the science of interbeing to bring
very much so, because I recognize a great deal of what is generally talked about as holistic thought is also on the threshold. As I was, of this sort of inverted view of reality, in which space comes in a sense first, or space is primary as the receptive presence, and form literally informs itself around, dynamically informs itself around receptive centers of space. And so you sort of, when I look at you, I see your figure as a dynamic inclusion of the space within you. And it's even more strange than that, because, modern physicists still talk about an atom being mostly space. They don't talk about it being all space. And that's how I see it. I see all material bodies as 100% space plus circulating energy. And the way you get to that idea is through understanding the fundamental nature of an intangible presence. Space is not a substance. And if we keep trying to measure it as if it's a substance and thinking of it as distance, then we'll never understand its real role as is essentially the receptive omnipresence everywhere without limit, around which material bodies dynamically come into form. And that's the inversion.
And I mean, this is difficult enough to get it's not just one's head around, because it's literally a consciousness shift, but like it's a different way of perceiving. So what's the role of like when you say fluctuations of energy, do you venture into also making a bridge into what the role of consciousness and the observer, or the observing wholeness, self-observing wholeness.
Yeah,
Is
the observing wholeness, I always want you to write it without a W.
okay.
The observing wholeness without a W. Yes. and in fact, I've just written a piece this morning entitled, the difference between the whole story without a W and the whole story with a W, essentially is the difference between natural geometry and abstract geometry. Yeah, so
Say some
where
more
this
say some more about the difference between natural I didn't catch
yeah,
that.
between essential and I actually, one of my favorite poetical quotes is from Robert Frost, who says that and it was, I think I've got it here actually because I was referring to it. Nature does not complete things. She is chaotic. Man must finish, and he does so by making a garden and building a wall, which is all about man trying to build an intellectual order of or contain nature within a naturally imposed order of limits and structures, which are actually the limits and structures of classical geometry, seen as a cage, if you like, for nature. But again, you can invert that classical Euclidean geometry, and instead of thinking of it as a structure imposed on space, you can think of it as a set of attractors around, in space, around which material comes into form, into being. Yeah. So it is a sort of, it's quite a radical inversion, and it's very, very simple when you get it. It's ridiculously simple when you get it. And in fact, it's the way I understood the world as a young child, and I can remember it even when I was 15 months old. That's how I understood the natural world, and then I was sort of completely shaken by my education,
Yeah,
which taught me the opposite of what I knew.
I completely, I mean, I've just sort of had the privilege of reliving that journey because my daughter's 3 years and 3 months old now, and to observe her process of, I mean, one way of how, I know that this is not aligned with your thinking, but you could call it embodiment, like the way she initially wasn't quite sure where she ended and all that out there started that she was still trying to process, and to really watch her become that, what we call self, like that observer, and how on the one hand that is very enabling, but it is also incredibly limiting, because it's beginning to cut yourself off from the ground of your own being, and then it's what Einstein alluded to with this illusion of consciousness, like that the whole, let's call it whole with an H, and observing itself from within needs a point of perspective in order to actually observe. But through that act of observance, which is, I think, what Maturana and Varela relate to in the Santiago theory of cognition, the self and the world basically create each other. And then it seems to the self that it's other than that world, but it actually is the observing conscious presence of that world.
Yes.
And that's quite difficult for
Yes,
scientists
yes.
to
I
get
mean,
their head
and
around.
a way that I sometimes used to try and put it when I was talking to students was because, and it's our binocular eyesight also has this effect, because our binocular vision combined with the way our brain works is very, very good at framing reality. If we had eyes on the side of our heads, I don't suppose we would ever have seen the world as we do. But we have eyes on the front of our faces, and that causes us to tend to see the world as a framed perspective.
Yeah,
and that
predatory perspective.
yeah, that's right. And we are indeed a predatory one. You know, it is. We have
Because
a
that's what
predator.
we like.
Yeah,
Deer have the eyes here, so they have more vision, so they can see
exactly.
what's coming.
So that's right. They've got panoramic vision, and
Yeah.
so immediately, if you've got panoramic vision, you're aware of yourself as a center of all around. Whereas if you've got binocular vision, with binocular vision automatically distances you from, you know, from what you're observing, and that leads us to objectify reality and to objectify ourselves. And so there's a sort of need to come back and a phrase I used to say was, recognize that what you're looking at includes you. Just that.
I had this really, because we started with Schumacher College. I'll share that. I mean, it's an amazing time that you have when you, like, particularly back in those days when Brian Goodwin was still alive and Henry Bortoft was still alive, and to literally rock up there in early September. And that was also the year that Stefan Harding's son was born. So we had a birth at the very beginning of our course. And then at the end of the teaching period, 4 months into it, Brian Goodwin had his aneurysm and almost died in front of us.
Yes.
And right in the middle of it was September 11th, the attack on the World Trade Centers. And while all that, in that sort of container of birth and almost death, and I had sudden exposure to, like, Goethean science, Gaia theory, complexity theory, Jungian psychology, lots of different wisdom traditions around the world, and meeting you. And I remember, I think we'd been working with Henry Bortoft and working on also Bohm's theory, and I would like to come back to that later on, how that relates to your theory of implicate and explicit order. And I was sitting one afternoon under one of the oak trees behind the college, and I literally fell into, like, it felt a bit like a psychedelic journey, but without an inducing substance, just by all the amount of information that I was processing at the time. And I fell into this, you can only describe it as if when you think of outer space from a kind of astronaut's perspective, inside of me, and this sentence came into my head: the inside is bigger than the outside. And it just, like, and it always stayed with me as a sort of deeper understanding of reality.
Yes, very much so. And this is the real story behind Doctor Who and the TARDIS. The TARDIS represents the inner self, which is enormous relative to how it looks on the outside. And this is actually the experience I had as a child, when, because my mother was a politician. She was deputy mayor of Nairobi at one stage in the 1950s, at the time of the Mau Mau. So it's a very traumatic time for me to come into the world and be in a country where all that was happening, and my mother was at the center of it. But what she used to do was she used to invite all sorts of people, you know, of all colors and religions and the rest, into her drawing room, and to form a circle.
Wow.
To talk about their ways of seeing the world. I mean, really, she was extraordinary in this way. And she was great. At one stage, she formed a strong friendship with the first president of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. And that got her into difficulty because she became seen as an enemy for making friendships across the divide, so to speak. But the experience for me was that I used to sit with her in these sharing circles. And I just remember the extraordinary sense. I had all these different extraordinary different faces, you know, some with turbans, some with beards, some dark, some white, you know, some in between. And I was sort of looking at them, and I just had this extraordinary sense that, you know, I felt the enormity of my inner self, but the tininess of how they looked from a distance.
Mm.
And then I thought, and it's exactly the same for them. I am just as much included in their world as they are included in mine. And the enormity within me is also the enormity within them. And that is essentially, what I understood, as I say, very, very young. And at that stage too, I had an awareness of a sense of consciousness, the remarkable, it's just such a strange feeling to sort of be aware of the consciousness within another creature, another person, which is this enormity within.
And it's not just human beings, like
not at all. No,
all other beings have their own.
It applies to all other beings, and in fact, to right down to subatomic level. When you work it out, is that, and this is to do with the infinity of space. True infinity, true infinity is not a limitless amount. It's intangibility. It's a true limitlessness. So that's why it's so important to get hold of this idea that space is not a substance. And if you try to measure space as if it's a substance, as if it's distance, for example, you can only measure distance with a ruler. A ruler measures itself. It's not measuring space. You can measure the tangible, you can't measure the intangible. So, and this is a strange thing, is that we're all brought up to think of infinity as a limitless amount, but it's not. But in fact, it's a limitless quality of an intangible presence everywhere.
See this, but this touches on so many of the really important kind of epistemological leverage points of shit, like, because I mean, there's a number. The whole thing about whole with H and whole with W, like the whole with W, even most people misunderstand as additive wholeness. It's a mechanical put things together and the parts together and you construct the whole. And what I learned from Henry Borthoff and the Goethean way of seeing is that wholeness is a relational dynamics that needs both parts and wholes, and they're mutually inclusive. They're not separate. So all life lives in the tension between being for oneself and simultaneously being as part of a larger whole. So that for one bit. But then also the space, the minute you talk about space, for Western trained people, the notion of time and distance immediately comes in. And I often, also back at Schumacher, felt like, particularly reading Bohm, that somehow how we perceive time is also at the crux of this. So I feel like what you're expressing with your theory has a real strong link into how do we understand consciousness, and also how do we understand time. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yes, it's really hard stuff to talk about, as you know. Because as soon as we use language, we're lost, as the saying goes. Because language is especially the Latin-based languages are continually trying to define, impose definition on reality. And so, this is why I started writing poetry. Actually, I think is I realized that in order to to get away from that tendency for language to seem to impose definition, you needed to use language more fluidly, in a more poetic way. And it's also why I do paintings, or at least why I realized that my paintings were always expressing, they have done all my life, the same basic principle of natural inclusion. Yes, so time and distance. Well, now, if you come to the realization that all natural form is flow form, all tangible natural form is flow form, and it consists of 100% intangible space, not 100% Cartesian space, that's different, yeah? Cartesian space is the cage. Natural space is intangible, void everywhere, and circulating energy. And that these are mutually inclusive, not mutually exclusive or one and the same. Then in a sense, you've got hold of, I think, the quintessence of consciousness as a receptive, responsive relationship between space and circulating and energy, so that we understand all tangible phenomena as a product of natural energy flow around and between local receptive centers of space. And now we're fully recognizing the relationship between the intangible, which is resistive form like this, yeah. The tangible, which is resistive form, and the intangible, which is non-resistive, and essentially, and hence can't readily be detected by measuring instruments, except in relation to their effects. So we're looking at this relationship between the intangible and the tangible, and if you like, I see consciousness or understand consciousness as the intangible. Yeah, and that also takes us into the realm of quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics is the realm of the intangible. And you can't study it, or you can't understand it in tangible terms, which is why there is such huge difficulty, in relating quantum mechanics to everyday mechanics, because essentially everyday Newtonian mechanics is all about tangible forms, banging into one another or whatever. Yes, it's billiard ball thinking, but what is lost in that is if you lose sight of the fact that those tangible forms are actually products of an underlying relationship between intangible presences, intangible energetic circulation, and omnipresent receptive space. So you've got this receptive responsive relationship, and that shrieks to me consciousness as being about and about how we feel when we're aware of our consciousness. We feel receptive to what's all around us, and we feel responsive. So it's this relationship between that internal receptivity. This is the young baby that you've observed, receptive to all around, yeah. Responsive also, and gradually recognizing the relationship between the receptive gathering in needful aspect too, because this is all about need. All living creatures are needful, not selfish. This is something that is very strong in my mind. When we're talking about recognizing the problems that were introduced by selfish gene theory, as soon as you portray an organism as selfish, that's a projection, human projection onto nature, which is not natural, but then excuses the kind of narcissistic behavior that we've seen expressed only too recently in very high positions of power. But anyway, but when we understand that,
both in your country and in America.
Indeed, yes, yes, a lot of it going on, and of course playing a very significant role in what's gone wrong too, in terms of pandemics and the rest of it.
Define a bit more the way you think of need there.
Well, need is that if any natural form comes into being as a result of energetic flow around a receptive center, then in order to occur, I like the word occurrence better than presence. I discovered this recently. Occurrence is a lovely word because it conveys both the presence and the dynamic simultaneously. Yeah, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, you know, I sort of moved on from the idea of presencing to occurrencing.
Sense. Yeah. It's much more dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's looking at, again, this relationship between the stillness of space, the universal stillness, omnipresent stillness of space, as this receptive calling presence, and the responsive energy flow, yeah, towards and around local centers of space, which of course gives you also a different understanding of the fundamental nature of gravity as a gravitational center, as a point of space, not a point of mass, which again breaks you away from traditional mathematical thought,
And
which
physics.
isolates the point mass from the surrounding space. So I said a lot there, didn't I?
Yeah, you just opened up two very big rabbit holes.
But you know, coming back is that in order to live, we have to receive energy. Just that. We are needful because in order to live at all, we have to receive energy. We have to eat. We have to drink. You know, so that fundamental, at a very fundamental level, makes all living creatures needful for a supply of energy. And that means that, you know, that there is a need to care for themselves as they care for others. Is if you deny your needfulness, and this happens to a lot of people. This is why altruism doesn't work. It's because if you try to deny your own needs, you won't be able to help anybody because you won't be there to help them.
Yeah, no,
so
I recently because it's become very popular in the last few years to define the big shift that we now need to make as the journey from the ego to the eco, and it then often creates a sort of dismiss the self, like, or the I, the me to the we is also what people often say, and it's yet again that pendulum swing in a sort of opposite, like, that extreme didn't work, let's go over to the other extreme, and instead of recognizing that the only way that you can serve the whole effectively over a long term is also to serve yourself, and it's through the service of to the fact that you actually never been separate, that you actualize both. So it's like I feel it's already come to my mind a couple of times in our conversation, Gurdjieff's statement that humans are third force blind, that we constantly stuck in these dualist opposites instead of seeing them as polarities that need that third force potential to manifest.
Or third influence, again, I might even put it, because almost what we're recognizing is that when you sort of have the idea of a receptive center that calls into becoming, then you're actually looking at an influence. It literally is that receptor, you know, a center of space is a center of influence that calls energy into motion. And so, and that motion then is a response to an influence. It's like in, you know, electromagnetic induction, really. It's that sort of, you know, the difference between force, which is an imposition from outside, and influence, which is the result of a calling calling inwards, which then is expressed outwardly in terms of a response.
That seems to be the answer to a question that I also wanted to ask, because you've a number of times talk about the circulating energy, and I want to get a bit clearer on because energy is used in very different ways, like how energy in what sense, and why is it circulating? What starts the motion?
Yeah, well, that's right. And it is very tricky, because actually the people's meanings of energy is so varied. and an engineer's meaning of energy is very different from a spiritual person's meaning. But the challenge for us is to bring those into confluence, or at least that's the challenge for me. And this is, I think of natural inclusionality. The natural inclusion is the phenomenon, if you like, which is simply the mutual inclusion of space and energy in all tangible phenomena. Natural inclusionality is, if you like, the philosophy of natural inclusion. And its role is to bring into confluence what appear to be polarities, and to recognize the complementarity of those polarities rather than their opposition. And that's its role. And that's why I call it the role of it. Yeah, it is the inclusive middle, which recognizes the need for both. Yeah, in mutual receptive responsive relationship, not opposition.
So it is only at the heart of whether humanity is going to have a future or not, whether we learn.
Yes, it is, because it's, we've all been taught and we've all witnessed oppositional politics. And, this is, the idea of warring sides. And it goes right back to Aristotle's law of the excluded middle. If you disallow the reality of the middle, which includes both sides, you'll be at war. So I mean, again, it's very, very fundamental and very, very deep, and teaching ourselves to believe in in these dualistic terms of opposition between polarities, when in fact, well, the polarities are, as I put it, imposters both.
Yeah,
they're non-existent extremes, but they're nonetheless tendencies. Yeah, but the reality is what exists between those extremes, not at the extremes.
Yeah, it's almost like we create a tension field in which then the reality can manifest, but you can never be.
You can neither be either or.
Yeah.
You constantly are both and continually.
And how, I mean, because it does seem somewhat compatible with the notion of implicate and explicit order, or at least I feel like Bohm was trying to grapple with the same thing, but maybe came up with a very different way of expressing.
Yes, it's always awkward for me because I haven't read in depth the work of so many people, and my own understanding of natural inclusion came about purely from myself. I hadn't read any of this work. I knew nothing about Bohm. I knew virtually nothing about Taoism. So many aspects. And this is why actually coming to Schumacher at that time taught me huge lessons too, because I was totally unaware of all these ideas. I'd just come to a realization myself, which is really a realization that I'd always had, that there must be this mutually inclusive relationship between what appear to be opposites.
I wanted to come back to another, because this is so difficult, as we've alluded to a number of times, to put into language because of the very structure of the language, particularly the language we're speaking with each other right now. And what impressed me when I first met you, because you showed me some of your paintings, and also you shared, I now remember the story of your presidential address of the British Mycological Society, and how simply using a painting in something like that, in a scientific event like that, already brought up the hackles of a lot of your peers. And while I understand that for you the visual expression was a way to circumnavigate what could only be faultily expressed in language in your journey of developing this. Because I feel like we need to, like, another deeply informative conversation I had at Schumacher College was with Arthur Zions, the physicist of Light, who also started the Mind and Life Institute and all the conversations between scientists and the Dalai Lama. And he back then 2002 said to me, Daniel, I think the next great revolution in human affairs will not come through the sciences, it will come through the arts. And of course, because I was studying holistic science, I felt a little bit, what do you mean? I thought holistic science was the answer. Yeah? And now, since then, I've really understood what he meant. I did a PhD in design in an art and design school, and understood that we need to be more visual in our thinking in order to overcome the limits of language thinking. So can you say a little bit more about your journey with art and how that was part of that story?
Yes, it is. It's very important to me. And it goes right back to school, where I wasn't allowed to study art because I was channeled down the scientific path, largely because of the influence of my father, who was an analytical scientist. And in fact, I think that I was influenced greatly too, because my father was an analytical scientist. My mother was a politician interested in human psychology, and they used to have rows. And I used to think, well, I didn't like my parents having rows, so I wanted to understand how both actually had a truth to provide to the other. And so and also, as I was being pushed down this scientific path, my sister actually played a significant role, and some of her boyfriends, because they could see what was happening to me. And they more or less told me to keep painting, because I like painting, despite the fact that I wasn't allowed to do it at school. And it became important for me as I went more and more down the analytical scientific path in my career to keep painting as a way of counterbalancing, and also as keeping an awareness of a kind that I've always seen can contribute to scientific understanding, just as scientific understanding can contribute to artistic endeavor. And, that's why sort of, as I was on the threshold of natural inclusionality, I formed a little venture called Bath Bio Art. And I was at that stage trying to show the relationship between how a biological scientist could use art, how a knowledge of biological science could inform art, but also how an appreciation of art could inform or assist biological science. So bio art was this coming together of these two. And of course, if you're going to talk about something like that, you need to show it in yourself. So I use my paintings to illustrate my own personal effort to relate my biological knowledge to my artistic appreciation. And there is something also about the very process of making a painting which informs you about the receptive-responsive relationship between space and energy flow. Because if you think of the canvas as the space and the paint as the energy flow, you have to use both to bring the form into realization. And at this stage, you probably noticed behind me, this is my painting I'm currently working on, which is doing exactly that. And you're seeing, as the painting emerges out of the canvas, this relationship, this receptive, responsive relationship between the blank canvas, which is calling for paint to be applied, and the expression, yeah, out into natural form. So this one's going to be called Nightburst, and it relates to your message on LinkedIn this morning that I happened to see about the dark ground and Rayner Marie Rilke's love of the dark ground, which of course is what I share. Darkness is love, not hate. And of course, one of the great human mistakes is to associate darkness with hate. Anyway, so yeah, I've lost sound for the moment.
I know. Sorry, it's because there's some drilling going on. About it.
Yeah.
But it's yet another one of those duality instead of dynamic polarity thinking that runs rife in our culture. The whole,
yes,
like, particularly in the kind of personal development, spiritual path crowd of seeking the light. Yeah.
Yes.
Denying the shadow, denying darkness, denying the creative potential in the dynamics between dark and light. That Goethe's theory of light was much more about that dynamism rather than a kind of splitting up of light in different spectral
exactly
colors.
So.
I think it even has a sort of racist element that we still.
It certainly does. I mean, undoubtedly, undoubtedly it's racist, and it's also misogynistic. So, you know, it is anti-female and it is anti-dark.
Yeah.
You know, because actually those two notions go together. And of course, this links again to the relationship between receptivity and responsiveness, which can be thought of in male-female terms of receptive female, responsive male, co-creating the birth of living form. You know, and it also goes back to, you know, the ancient notions of a sacred marriage between the male and the female co-creating, yeah, as co-creations of reality, and then the notion of religions which essentially deny the female, literally denigrate the female, which has means blacken the female, yeah. And elevate the male into a patriarchy. So
have you, because this is like, you're really addressing so many of the core cultural pathologies or perceptual pathologies that keep us in repeating the same mistakes, because we just can't switch out of seeing the world in a way that unifies opposites into a developmental dynamic. I mean, after you left, I mean, you got all the way, sort of climbed up the scientific ladder to become president of the society of your field, British Mycological Society, and then right at that point decided you needed to step out of that in order to continue the work that you were called to do. How have you? Because I saw that in 2017 you did publish this book on the origin of life patterns. In the natural inclusion of space and flux, that one, exactly. And it is published by Springer, which is a scientific publisher. Have you maintained attempts to communicate to scientific peers or find peers that are willing to have conversations with you around this, or how is this?
Yeah, I've tried, but to be honest, I find that it's very, very difficult. I recently had quite a long conversation with a scientific colleague, a lovely scientific colleague who I meet or used to meet before the lockdown in the supermarket every Friday. And he was talking about Darwinism. And he said, "Alan, what do you really think about Darwin?" And I said what I really thought about Darwin, which was that he had a wonderful insight into the evolutionary relationship of all life on Earth. and a diabolical interpretation by way of natural selection as the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. And that is how I feel about it, is that he had, you know, as a naturalist, he saw this wonderful reality of us all being, all living creatures on planet Earth being related evolutionarily. And at the same time, to put it in the box of a defining logic that splits self from the other.
Well, even, I mean, it's not, it's self from other, it's one species from another. It's a picture of life that loses in tunneling into the relationship between categories, species, individuals, loses the underlying unity that life, first and foremost, is a planetary process, probably a cosmic process.
Yeah. I mean, I will mention my slight allergy to, because I have allergies to certain words, as you've probably noticed a lot by now, and it annoys people no end when I point them out. They think I'm being, they sometimes think I'm being aggressive or anti this or, but reality is, again, and this, it also goes back to the issue of wholeness and unity, is I talk about communion. Because it's so important to recognize the difference and the similar and the commonness at the same time. So I talk about, you know, I talk about diversity in community or diversity in communion. And there is this problem of trying to unify, make one, that tends to go, as you described earlier, with the destruction, the elimination of the individual. You know, so the individual, you know, and the elimination of the ego, as if the ego is all evil, whereas you know, if you understand the ego as all needful, then you have just such a, you know, then you have such a different understanding. So I pick up on words, you know, like hold this with a W, and unity, simply because in so many people's, you know, I might, you know, between you and me, we can use the words we like because we're in a, we have a rapport, we appreciate what each other is saying, and the language actually is just a way in. But out in the big wide world, certain kinds of language have very polarizing effects. And that's why I'm so very ridiculously careful in many people's minds in terms of the language that I use. Just that, it's something to explain, and I'm always trying to move away from the language that imposes definition in one way or another, consciously or unconsciously, and language which enables you to appreciate flow. But there's a huge difference between the language of flow and the language of definition. And I think it's important because just that question of, especially when we're trying to communicate something which many perceive as very intellectual, a scientific intellectual concept or whatever, into a wider domain. If we use language which will be interpreted in a very, you know, is liable to be interpreted in the wrong way, then that's something to be aware of. But you know, it's a difficult issue. I find it a very difficult issue because I don't like seeming to challenge, but at the same time I feel obliged to.
It's kind of, it's so important to make people more aware of the power of language. That, like, I mean, I use a lot the framework of design because I did my PhD in design, and I built this whole theory about design being human intentionality expressed through interactions and relationships. There's a blindness to the fact how much words and concepts are powerful design that is upstream in the design process that actually define how we see ourselves, how we see the world, and therefore what real and perceived needs we see in the world, and then how we arrange our human affairs from creating a glass to creating an economic system or a city.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So I'm completely with you. And you also alluded to it. It depends on who you talk to. Like some language is okay with somebody because you sort of understand the fallibility of language anyway, and in other circumstances, it really triggers or brings up completely different understanding.
Yeah.
So I often wonder, is one language enough? Do you like, because depending on who you talk to, you need to sometimes build bridges, take people along a journey of learning that you can only invite them to speaking their language, not your ideal language. And then when they've walked that path, then you can kind of say, and by the way, we've been using this term, but actually this term is deeply flawed. Let's
Yes, I mean, and yeah, and of course, inevitably, all of us as individuals speak different languages because we've had such different influences on the way we express ourselves. So it's always important to listen generously, forgivingly, and also to recognize that there may be many different ways of essentially saying the same thing.
Yeah. That's another, in terms of my experience of the kind of normalization or the boxing process that happens when you're inducted into natural sciences as a discipline, or even that intellectual discourse in the Western world as some form of activity. We are trained to listen to the mistake of the other. It's always like people think that that's an intellectually stimulating discourse when you kind of go, yes, but, or you don't even say, yeah. So you immediately find the bit that you disagree rather than celebrate the ground of agreement.
Precisely,
and I remember doing this very consciously when I worked on my PhD. As I was picking up people's work to see if it related to the construct I was building, I noticed how quickly, when you deeply disagree with an author on something, it changes how you read the subsequent paragraphs and the subsequent chapters. And so I made a conscious practice of saying, I shall not be triggered by what I consider the BS in this book. I'm looking for the diamonds in this work, because everybody, we're all limited in our journey of learning. We all have mistakes in our thinking, but that doesn't mean that we can't contribute brilliant insights as well. And I'm more interested in collecting the brilliant insights and connecting them rather than having long academic disputes with somebody over where I disagree.
Very, very much so, and that's exactly how I feel. Too. Yeah, that's just so. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
But in all this, like we were talking earlier before we started recording about another false dualism between theory and practice, and how we very often divide that. And I don't want to fall with this question I'm about to ask you into creating that false division. But for the sense of people listening, if you think of the significance of the work that you're trying to bring into the world with your books, your poetry, your art, and your journey of the last 20 years, how would you see the world change? And how would, like, if rather than finding the people not taking it up, if things started to flow beautifully with regard to the uptake of what you're talking about, how would that shift science, the community you live in, the relationship of humanity to the natural world? And would it maybe contribute to an answer to our pressing problems of climate change, ecosystems collapse, and all that?
Well, I think the answer, of course, to that question is yes, it would change all that radically. How would it change it? I think we would be automatically more compassionate because we'd have a deeper understanding of our needfulness and our vulnerability. We would automatically be much keener to to be reasonable. In other words, to use arguments that are experience-based and make sense. And we'd be much less ready to use unreasonable argument and rhetoric. And that links also to being more honest. So we've created a competitive culture, and that culture creates falsehood. It creates all those things. It creates unreasonableness. It creates cruelty. It creates unkindness. Sorry, I know what I don't know whether I said all three that I meant to, but it does create, the very idea that life is a struggle for existence leads to particular kinds of behavior. If we think that's true, then we will behave in certain ways which will put me first, without realizing that me first needs you too. So we've got to move out of that domain. I actually also think we have to move out of the domain of pure cooperation. The idea that moving out of a competitive culture means all being, all agreeing with one another and as a cooperative, because and that takes you essentially into a communistic type of philosophy of and so it's important to arrive at this place where both individuality and collectiveness are equally respected and understood. And then, so much of our efforts. I mean, people worry about what light bulbs you use, but you watch warplanes crossing the sky day to day because of the enormous defense budgets of countries. If you're really wanting to be...
Boris Johnson announced that he was going to spend more money on 200 million on Brexit, 200 billion on Brexit, 16 billion on defense, and 10 billion on the big green recovery that he's been...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that shows you the perverted logic of the situation we're in when we continue to accept that we're inhabiting a competitive culture. And it's, as I say, it's not cured by making us all the same.
Well, for me, more and more like that, you referred to the Rilke poem that recently friends put to this beautiful animation and had Vandana Shiva read it, the Dear Darkening Ground. But there's another Rilke quote that I start my book with, which is letters to a young poet. You must live the questions, because sometimes the answers are written in books that you don't know the language of yet. And so live deeply into the question, and then maybe one day you will live into the answer without even knowing. And for me, that speaks to something that is also one of these equally profound fundamental inversions of a habit of consciousness. That we are trained to seek for answers and solutions, and hence see questions and inquiry as just a transitory process to get to a finite endpoint, answer and solution.
Yeah.
And then history shows us over and over again that yesterday's solutions become today's problems. And so it's incredibly hubristic and arrogant to think that today's solutions, no matter how holistically informed and dynamic and regenerative they are, could last forever and create some form of arrival where we can down tools and live happily ever after. And also, and this is the other bit which I think is even more important with regard to this culture of discourse, of disagreement, of fighting it out, is the minute we would accept that all perspectives have a blind spot, that all acts of conscious participation in nested dynamic wholeness, I'm sorry, I'm still using that word, is limited. But if we allow multiple ways of knowing and multiple perspectives, and the way to allow them is to put this question and the inquiry at the center, and basically admit that no matter how good one perspective is, it will have its blind spot and its limitations. And so that then immediately doesn't create a culture of conflict, but a culture of cooperative inquiry. But it doesn't mean that we can't argue it out between these different disciplines. Like suddenly our diversity of opinion and our diversity of perspective becomes part of life's diversity and richness that enables creativity and enables regenerativity, in the sense of enabling us to continue to develop and respond to transformation in that brings us forth.
Yeah, I fully concur with you, and what you've just described is what I would call true democracy, which doesn't exist except in indigenous sharing circles, where, and in my mother's sharing circle, where she deliberately brought all points of view together to, recognizing that there would be, to provide a place of confluence in which all those different points of view can be understood and appreciated as contributions to the truth of the reality. That is true democracy for me, and that's literally the whole point without a W of the receptive whole without a W at the center, calling all the different voices into confluence, out of which emerges if you like, a holographic awareness, a more holographic awareness of the reality than that which comes from standing apart and looking from one particular angle only.
And in order to hold the wealth of collective intelligence that those circles, whether like your mother's circle sounds like just like an indigenous wisdom circle, but I mean I've sat in a lot of council circles, sort of practiced in the way of council in the tradition of the Ojai Foundation, and one of the council carriers that who've done a lot to train people up around the world in this particular technique is a woman called Virginia or Gigi Coyle. And I always remember Gigi sharing these stories on how when Western developers sat in indigenous council circles in the part of the US that she was from, very often at the end of the council, they were keen to have, so what's our decision? Like, what have we decided? They wanted this written down definition of what that process got to, and that completely misses the way of, there's no need for a decision if you've truly heartfully listened to the circle, because the definition would again crystallize it down to something that has a blind spot, but the awareness from, like, so it's not about, and that's to bring the loop back to what you were highlighting, because I can hold up my hand that sometimes I fall prey to overswinging the pendulum, holding up collaboration, cooperation as the center and the solution to everything, and that can come across as denying competition to be part of that dynamic. And so I think in that more inclusive council circle, there can be ideas that are opposed, and they actually create more potentiality because they are opposed, and you can agree to disagree, and find the agreement in the necessity to still hold all those perspectives. And so it's
Yes,
kind of
that's right. And I sometimes put it in terms we can disagree to agree as well. by recognizing the differences, that actually allows us to understand, the reality at the heart of those differences. One of the questions I used to start my life environment and people course with when I was teaching it at Bath University, something I did after breaking away from my background. I just asked them, what is a tree? And everybody would contribute an idea about what is a tree. And they were all different. And yet they all contributed to the same basic understanding, of what a tree is. And that is, and that is, it's a really important human process, I feel. To be able to do that. I mean, the classic story of the blind men around the elephant, each giving a different picture of what an elephant is, but you would never know what an elephant was from each of those individual stories. You had to bring them together because each of them contributed a significant truth, which is why it's a holographic truth and all round. And this is, it goes back to what I say, the basic human difficulty of being a predator or a grasper with binocular vision is that we lose that panoramic circumspection, literal circumspection, which enables us to have a more comprehensive awareness of the reality in which we're all situated, and being able to recognize one another's blind spots and forgive them and mistakes. I suffer from quite severe OCD, anxiety type states, which are associated with being brought up in a highly competitive culture and a desperate fear of failure and error and mistake that comes out of that. And that contributes quite a lot, in the background to me. But, the moment I feel that, well, actually we can really, truly forgive one another's mistakes and recognize that the mistakes we make can actually also provide insights, extraordinary insights. This is an important thing to understand. Yeah. And actually, when you look at the really huge breakthroughs in science, they've all been made by mistake. They've all been made when people have, Fleming's discovery of penicillin, whatever it might be, they've happened when something went wrong, which caused you to take another look at your presuppositions.
Yeah, no, I mean, mistakes is a fast way to learning. That's for sure. But unless you lose confidence in continuing the journey of inquiry through mistakes because the culture tells you that you're a failure if you made mistakes, rather than you celebrate that the learning that comes out of each one of them.
Exactly. Yes.
I just wanted to share one story with you. I don't know, do you know who Paul Stamets is?
Yes, I do. Yes, I met him actually.
He's a great fan of yours.
Oh, well, yes. Well, yeah, and I'm quite a fan of his as well, really. I think he's brought the world of fungi to notice and to wider public notice in a way that probably nobody else could do.
Well, somebody else, one of his, Paul has a property on Cortes Island, and Rupert Sheldrake and him are basically neighbors in terms of property on this island. So Rupert's two kids grew up on holidays, very often hanging out with the neighbor Paul Stamets, and that Merlin Sheldrake has recently. Have you read this book yet?
I've seen it because he sent it to me.
Ah, nice. Yeah, I haven't. Yes. I just got it. I haven't started to read it yet.
No. Merlin was generous enough to send me a copy.
Mm-hmm. And well, the reason I bring those two up is that I feel the work that you did initially with fungi, particularly about the mycelial ecosystem network in the forest and the connection. Where does the tree end and where does the fungus start? How does the fungal network actually grow up into the tree, that if you dissolved all the cellulose away, you'd actually be left with a sort of ghostly mycelial structure that in the shape of the forest.
Yeah.
And also, like, linking with your artwork, what I have you experimented with using those entry points of taking people into nature and that storytelling into bringing people into a more embodied understanding of your work?
Yes, I have. And in fact, you know, for quite a long time, you know, between I was president of Bath Natural History Society, and I made a point of outreaching to people in that kind of a way. But once again, there is this huge difficulty in that if people have been brought up to think in a particular way, and in particular an atomistic way, no matter how hard you might try to show them through example and all these illustrations. I mean, one of the things that I would regularly use is to use this little hand lens and take people up to the lichens and mosses growing on a tree and show them how it looks through the hand lens, and they're usually shattered because they never realized that such extraordinary diversity of form existed, you know, at all. And I usually boast at the beginning, within 30 seconds, I'll show you something you've never seen in your life before. And I do so with this. You know, that certainly stimulates huge interest and opening up of awareness. But what is incredibly difficult to get past is, you know, the effects of thousands of years of entrainment in Aristotelian logic, you know, which has been taught at school. It's been passed down the generations. You know, almost everybody accepts Darwinism as the truth of evolution, which I don't. I believe evolution is true, but not Darwinism, and so on and so on. And as soon as I give expression to that, you can see the shutters come down, and that's a really big problem. You know, likewise with the artwork, a lot of people love my artwork. Quite a few people hate it, or don't see the point of it at all. But I just do it. As you pointed out, you know, you show, and it happened to me at the university when I taught this life, environment and people course, and a large component of that course was to ask all these scientists as one of their courseworks to produce a piece of art illustrating their learning from the course. And then I used to hold an exhibition of that learning, and my colleagues went bonkers because they saw I was, you know, oh, you're anti-science, you're teaching students, you know, the wrong thing, you're misguiding, you're doing all sorts of, it's horrible, actually. And there was this wonderful expression that the students themselves had brought out to reveal, you know, how their understandings had been transformed by incorporating an artistic as well as a scientific approach to their understanding. But it's certainly created a very adverse reaction amongst many of my colleagues, and it took an enormous effort of will for me to keep the course going, which I did for 11 years. So I was quite proud of that, to keep a course like that going in the midst of a temple of worship of brickwork. You know, that took some doing, but it's you know, the antagonism, the hostility you produce sometimes it's called cognitive dissonance. You know, when you present something that actually seems to contradict what a person has been taught or learned to accept all their life, it is problematic. But then it's something that I've been through too. You know, I was taught to contradict what I understood as a child, and eventually came back to what I understood as a child.
It makes me think, and again, that what I'm about to say will bring up the hackles of a number of people listening. Is that one way of because we started with fungi, and we mentioned Paul, the use of sacred plant medicine in the expansion of consciousness, or shifting conscious experience, even temporarily, has been with us as a species ever since we possibly, it might even be what made us human. It could be that the first primates that started eating sacred plants developed a different frontal neocortex than the ones that didn't. And I feel like, particularly when I look at friends in the work and friends on the journey, very many, not necessarily indulge in those kind of sacred substances regularly, but many of them have had moments in their life where a door of perception was literally opened by them, and specifically in terms of the healing 2,000 years of conscious tram tracking, of putting us onto a rail that can only run in one direction. It is a powerful way, but it's also, it can be dangerous depending on who takes it. Where's your, how do you see those?
Yes, I mean, I think any way that helps open the doors of perception, but in ways that doesn't cause injury, is okay. Personally, I've actually never indulged. I'd indulge in alcohol quite a lot, but I haven't indulged in hallucinogenic fungi, for example. And I think I'd be scared, to be honest, but perhaps because my own doors of perception are so wide open already. Perhaps I don't need. I don't need to be pushed right over the edge.
What I'm going to say is, I mean, this is the most way of complimenting. It's like you fell, like Asterix and Obelix. You fell into the potion.
Yeah. Very early. Yes, I think I possibly did. Perhaps my father made some more mistakes in his identification than I realized at the time, when he was feeding me all these different fungi to eat. Yeah, I've become much scareder of doing it because I realized just how easy it is to make mistakes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not something that I've done in the last 10, 15 years, but back in California in the 90s, I certainly, I feel I did a massive jump in my own understanding and learning of who I was and what the world was, through some experience with those substances. It's just that we really need to break out of those mental tram tracks if we want to find solutions to the urgent problems that we're now facing.
And any way we can do that is necessary, is valuable.
And unfortunately, I need to cut us off here because I actually have a meeting in half an hour that I need to get to. But this has been a wonderful conversation. I hope it's the first of many. Let's have another one in the new year. And I've done more reading. But before we close, is there any particular place that you would like to highlight to people where they can find more of your work?
Yes, well, I have a website, it's a website which is a Spanglefish website, and I don't pay for it, so you have to tolerate the adverts. But the actual reference to it, I just have to speak it for the moment. It's http, // and then it's www.spanglefish.com, and then / and then the last bit is exploring natural inclusion, all one word, exploring natural inclusion. And that has just about, provides access to just about everything I've written. The danger of it, I expect, to many people is it just looks like it looks totally overwhelming because I've written so much over the last, but it's all saying the same thing, essentially. And if you want to know what that thing is, you'll get it on the first page if your mind is open to it.
Yeah, no, I recognize that, like, my Medium blog now also has some 580 articles, and it's beginning to be like a wall of overwhelm for people
Yeah.
to say, where do I start?
Yeah, and I think that's also what happened to you. You sort of thought, bloody hell, Alan. Oops, sorry about the language. Alan's written so much about this; it's going to take me forever to get to know it. But actually, the essence of it is ridiculously simple.
Well, the piece I'll link a few pieces with this video, and the piece you sent me a couple of weeks ago was actually very precise and
yeah.
Thank you so much. And
yeah, well, thank you for making contact after all this time. That's lovely to see you, and great to see the work that you're doing.
Thank
All
you.
the best then.
All the best. Bye.
Bye.